Welcome to Annunciation Radio's Faith with Reasons, the program that examines what the church teaches and why. Faith with Reasons.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this spring-like Wednesday, the 29th day of January, where it's now currently 40 degrees.
It's unreal.
It's pretty crazy. But glad you are along with us. And as far as what the church teaches and why, we like to look toward really the origins. And you have to go to the church fathers for that. You kind of have to go to the doctors of the church to learn this. And it really helps us kind of figure out, how the church got its footing, so to speak. So we're looking forward to our conversation today with Dr. James Papandrea, who we've had on before, because he's written so much on the topic, and he's kind of everywhere. So can't wait to connect with him. Let's connect with you, Shayne. What's going on? What's new?
Not much. I'm enjoying this warm weather. I mean, it could be quite bitter for a late January day. But we've been blessed with this mild weather, and I'm looking at the forecast now for the next couple of weeks. What they're projecting, it looks like a roller coaster, a yo-yo, up and down. So, but it's winter, so you can't complain. I mean, I would expect snow and cold temperatures. So we'll wait to see what the next week brings.
Well, and not too long ago, Lake Erie was 85% frozen over.
Yeah.
And so a lot of ice fishermen and women out there. And now lately, with these warm temperatures and the winds, which is the big deal, little pieces are breaking off and people are floating away.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They have to be rescued and so forth. So be careful out there.
That's a big deal. I mean, they have these ice floes and, they get stuck. I wouldn't want to be out there, that's for sure.
I mean, ice fishing is fun, but man, I don't know if
except
it gets cold enough long enough.
Except when you break away and float.
God, that's the only. I want to stay put.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Well, whatever you do to enjoy this weather, make sure you keep us on because we always have some fascinating conversations. Why? Because we always book the best guests.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Dr. James Papandrea is a professor of church history and historical theology at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. Dr. Jim's an award-winning author and professor of church history and historical theology, as well as host of the Catholic Culture podcast, The Way of the Fathers. Now, Dr. Jim was baptized Catholic, confirmed Lutheran, and ordained Methodist. Got that?
Oh, yeah.
His study of the church fathers is what brought him back to the Catholic Church of his Italian heritage. He's written more than 25 books, which have been translated into multiple languages, and has a YouTube channel called The Original Church. You can get more information on his website. It's www.jimpapandrea.com, and it's really kind of spelled just the way it sounds, Papandrea. And his Amazon authors page is drjimbooks.com, and we're going to talk today about the Catholic Culture podcast series, The Doctors of the Church. So, Dr. Papandrea, thank you for joining us. Welcome back to Faith with Reasons.
Hey, fellas. Thanks for having me back. It's really good to be on with you again. And, appreciate being here.
Now, the Way of the Fathers, we've talked a lot about the Doctors of the Church and the early church and how it's formed and how these wise men really set us on the right path along the way here and really kind of did some interpretation for us. So this is going to be a great podcast series that will help us learn more about these fathers, these Way of the Fathers podcast here. So how did you come to do this? I know you have a tremendous interest, obviously, in the early church history and historical theology, but you've written extensively on it, and I'm sure had a lot of videos before about it. But now with this series, which really you just debuted recently, right? How did that come about?
Yeah, so, I got to back it up a bit and say that the Way of the Fathers podcast was actually started with, the original host of it was my good friend Mike Aquilina. And Mike is also an expert on the church fathers and the early church. And so he did that podcast on the early church fathers for about 3 years. And when he was ready to move on to other things, he wanted to pass the baton on to me, for which I will always be grateful. And so I took over the Way of the Fathers podcast on Catholic culture. And we did my first series on that, or season, if you will, was a series on the heresies of the early church, and that was great fun. And I did some more episodes on lesser known early church fathers, but it was the Catholic culture folks who came to me and said, "Hey, let's do a series on the doctors of the church." And so the doctors of the church, some of them are early church fathers, but not all of them are from the early church. The doctors of the church span the whole history of the church, more or less, and so that means I would have to expand beyond the early church, and some of the doctors of the church I've never really studied before, so I'm actually doing some more research than I would have had to do for the early church fathers, but it's a lot of fun, and I'm excited about it.
Now, how many doctors of the church are there?
There are now 37, and the Pope could proclaim more at any time, but at this moment there are 37.
Yeah, we always thought with Pope St. John Paul II that he would be named a doctor of the church.
Could happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how that process works? Is it just the Pope, or does he have a committee or a council that gets together on a regular basis or infrequent basis to sit down and say, okay, who do we elect next to be named a doctor?
Yeah. As I understand it, it would be the same council that would advise the Pope on declaring someone a saint.
Okay.
And so, the Pope doesn't do these things on his own. He always does them in consultation with his colleague bishops. And, in this case, I'm sure that I'm not going to get the name right, but there is a dicastery for the cause of saints,
mm-hmm.
and it would be that same group that would then also advise the Pope on whether someone should be declared a doctor of the church.
So now would probably be a good time. Many of our listeners are probably, okay, I get saints, I understand that, and I've heard this term father. I don't really understand what father is, but now you're talking about doctorates. So maybe we should start with, explaining, are the doctors, are they all fathers, or not all fathers are doctors, and are they all saints? So maybe we should start with an explanation for any of those that are listening that may not know.
Yeah, and there was a time when I had to look this up too. So there's no shame in not having a clarity around this. If we had visuals, I'd have a Venn diagram or something. But basically, it works like this: when we talk about the fathers of the church, we are talking about those bishops and theologians from the early church who were especially influential on the church, the church's teaching and tradition. So the term fathers of the church is kind of limited to the early church, which we might say is maybe the first 5 or 6 centuries, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that term, fathers of the church, is not really an official designation. It's kind of loosely defined, and there are some whom I would say are fathers of the church that others might disagree with me, and vice versa. But generally, the fathers of the church are from the early church. Now, saints are people who are officially considered worthy of following their example. Now, many of them were martyrs, but many were not. They were just especially holy people.
Mm-hmm.
The church has a process for declaring someone a saint now, and some of us may be familiar with some of the more recent people who have gone through this process, like Carlo Acutis and some of these others. And so in modern times, we have a process for this, and there is an official designation. But many of our most beloved saints come from so early in the history of the church that there wasn't yet an official process. And so we say that they're saints on the basis of the fact that they were martyrs. Anyone who's a martyr for the faith is pretty much in as a saint. Others are saints by tradition. And so the designation of a saint is also a little bit open. It's more official than father of the church, but it's a little bit more open, especially in the early centuries of the church. But of course, the saints can come from any time within the church's history. A doctor of the church is someone who has been designated specifically by a pope as a doctor of the church. What does that mean? The word doctor is really just the Latin word for teacher. And so a doctor of the church is someone whom our Holy Father or a pope has said is so influential on the teachings and tradition of the church that they are significantly important to our church teachings. And so, like the saints, a doctor of the church can come from any time in the church's history, but it is someone who's been designated as a doctor of the church by a pope. So, unlike the term fathers of the church, it is more official. So at the end of the day, all doctors of the church are saints. No one would be declared a doctor of the church without being a saint, although some have been declared saint and doctor at the same time. So all doctors of the church are saints, but not all fathers of the church are saints. We have some influential early church fathers who are not saints for one reason or another, and not all saints are fathers of the church. Not all saints are doctors of the church. But all of the doctors of the church have to be also saints.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we just celebrated St. Thomas Aquinas, who is not only a doctor of the church, but also angelic doctor of the church. So kind of an extra distinction due to, obviously he was quite the teacher and left voluminous writings for us to learn from as well.
Yeah, that's true. Of course, Thomas Aquinas is hugely influential on everything that comes after his time in the church. And these titles, or these sort of, I call them nicknames for the doctors of the church, like the angelic doctor, many of them have these. I would say most of them have these. Some are more official or more sort of commonly known than others. But most of them have some kind of nickname like this, or some kind of designation that is meant to describe something about them.
So there's a designation for their ability to teach. Now, I am familiar with, do I describe it as nuances or there's seemingly some sort of problem in some of the things that the doctors have said in their writings. I guess what I'm getting to is it's not somebody that obviously holds what the Catholic Church teaches, the Pope being infallible. I mean, they can make mistakes in things that they've written. I guess a Pope can make a mistake, and just not in church teaching. But these are people that are specifically saying, listen to this person because they are a teacher. So one would be inclined to think that, because they're a teacher, everything they say is correct, but that's not the case.
You're right. Just because someone is designated, even by a pope, as a doctor of the church, that does not imply that they are infallible. Even with the pope, as you said, it's by virtue of his office, and only in the case of certain pronouncements is the pope infallible. But just being a doctor of the church doesn't mean that someone is infallible. There are doctors of the church who have said things that, not heresy or anything, but they've said things that the church has said, yeah, well, we don't agree with that, and this is not going to become part of the church's official teaching. So just because a doctor of the church said or wrote something doesn't automatically mean that that's going to become part of the church's teaching. But what this means is that in general, these doctors of the church are generally trustworthy for us. And just like any saint is someone that the church is saying, you can emulate, you should imitate this person in the holiness of their life. Well, a doctor of the church this is the church taking the next step and saying, you should emulate or imitate this person in the life of the mind, and their teachings are generally trustworthy.
You're listening to Faith with Reasons here at Annunciation Radio, and our guest, Dr. James Papandrea. Dr. Jim is a professor of church history and historical theology at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, and, of course, written extensively, written a number of books. And his Way of the Fathers from Catholic Culture series, called The Doctors of the Church, is available now, and you can go to his YouTube channel by going to his website, or you can just go to, I would say the originalchurch.locals.com and check this out. Now, is that the best way for people to access this series, or any shortcuts?
Well, if they're looking for the podcast, I would actually just go to the Catholic Culture website, because there's a lot of other great content there as well. So that would be catholicculture.org. I think that's the quickest way to go. Catholic Culture also has their own YouTube presence, and of course the podcasts are available there as well.
And you mentioned earlier that Catholic Culture is are the ones that are producing this for you. That's probably, I would say, I know I've had experience to getting their content on YouTube, and it appears to me that there's a lot there in addition to this. So that might be the one of the better places, I would agree, through YouTube, and that's just Catholic Culture's channel at YouTube.com. One thing that you mentioned previously that I guess it was wanted to maybe dive into a little more was, you mentioned that obviously there's a lot of things that have been said by some of these doctors that is not, might have been by mistake, or they just didn't have enough knowledge at the time to be talking about what they were talking or mentioning. Do you have an example that might, I guess, expound on that, help somebody understand, how that can come to be?
Yeah, I can give a couple of examples. A real simple example is Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, mm-hmm. who was writing in the 2nd century. He's actually the most recent addition to the list of doctors, writing in the 2nd century, and so you wouldn't think he would get his 1st century timeline wrong, but he makes an offhanded comment about Jesus Christ, doing his ministry during the reign of Claudius, the emperor. Well, that's not correct. It was during the reign of Tiberius, and so he just got his dates mixed up. Okay. Another example could be Thomas Aquinas, who, and I don't claim to be an expert on Aquinas, but as I understand it, Aquinas was not convinced about the Immaculate Conception of Our Lady, which, of course, the Church affirms. So that would be, maybe that's debatable, but that's as I understand it. And then, of course, the biggest example, I think, is St. Augustine himself, who, in his debate with the heretic Pelagius, as I tell it, he kind of painted himself into a corner and almost invented Calvinism, because he went a little too far down the road toward predestination.
Wow.
And, of course, he did not cross the line into heresy, but, when some of the Protestant reformers came along, they picked up where he left off, and I would argue, they did cross the line into heresy, because then you get these doctrines like once saved, always saved, and some of these things that are kind of, the logical conclusion of some of the things that Augustine was saying. But Augustine said these things at the end of his life in the context of this controversy, didn't really have the opportunity to clarify. And so, again, nobody's calling St. Augustine a heretic, but he is a doctor of the church, and there are some things he said that eventually the church would say, yeah, well, we're not going to go down that road with him,
And we can probably say, or at least it seems to me reasonable, that we can say you can still rely on the teachings of these folks, because we have an element of tradition in the church. In other words, those are our guardrails as the church stands today, by preventing us from going too far into any of those readings or any of those teachings if they happen to be problematic.
Absolutely, yeah. So each of these doctors, Augustine included, is trustworthy for us to read. But to your point, no one is saying pick one of the doctors of the church and only read that person and read nothing else. Obviously we have the whole tradition of the church that provides checks and balances. So that's a good point.
And as far as Aquinas is concerned, you went into depth with him. There's enough people that have followed Aquinas, and certainly those that have studied Aquinas, but those that have carried his work even further, that would base that on the tradition of the church and put it in balance with the tradition of the church to justify that. Yeah,
I mean, Aquinas is like Augustine, one of those doctors of the church who is. It's difficult to even encapsulate his contribution to the church in any kind of short statement. In fact, I would argue that Aquinas is even harder to get your head around than Augustine, because at least with Augustine you can say, well, I'm going to read this document or that document. But with Aquinas, his thoughts on each topic are spread out over the Summa and all of his writings, and so you almost have to be an expert on Aquinas to see the big picture of his thought. So it's very difficult to encapsulate that, and I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing him at all. I am just not an expert on Aquinas and his thought per se.
So since there's so much that has been done with the series, and now you're picking it up and you're just beginning this part or this mini series of this, focusing on the doctors alone. How do you address the work that's been done previously, with this moving forward? Because obviously you're beginning with I saw here on the site, it looks like the second one that you did was on Bede. It seems like you're several centuries beyond, those that have been, that were considered doctors before.
Right. Well, we are in general going chronologically according to when these doctors of the church lived, except for the fact that because we have basically 4 years of episodes on the early church fathers,
yes,
it seemed better to the producers to start sort of where the early church leaves off and move forward through the history of the church. And then when we get to the end, we will go back again and revisit those doctors of the church who are also early church fathers. And so, Mike Aquilina had done episodes on pretty much all of the early church doctors of the church. And so when I began the series, I started with Bede, and there are 2 episodes on Bede that are out. And then the next one coming up is St. Gregory of Merrick, who is another one of our latest additions to the list. But he comes next in the sequence. And so I'll track through the history of the church up to the present day, and then I'll go back to the beginning and pick up starting with Irenaeus and moving forward from there. And we're doing 2 episodes on each doctor of the church. So the first episode basically explores their life and why they're a saint. And then the second episode goes deeper into their legacy in terms of their writings and their work, and why they deserve to be considered a doctor of the church. But to answer your question about how I'm approaching it, I'm approaching it as though the listener is being introduced to these doctors of the church, and so I'm assuming that that our audience is made up of people who aren't scholars, who haven't studied this stuff. And so I'm not trying to do anything too in-depth or cover all of the ground that a scholarly treatment would, but rather I'm trying to give the listener an introduction. So who is this person? Maybe they've never heard of them, maybe they have, but who is this person and why are they important? And in 2 episodes, I do that, and then at the end of the second episode, I'm going to be giving people kind of an entry point. if you want to find out more about this doctor of the church, here's what you should read. Or if you want to read one of their documents and hear them in their own words, here's the best one to start with that's not too overwhelming. And so just kind of giving people an introduction and an entry point into that doctor of the church, and then it would be up to individuals if they want to go deeper.
Yeah, which I think is brilliant because it makes it very accessible, and you get to learn. And so many people like you have kind of come into the church through study of the church fathers. Many will be looking at doctors of the church and learning their lessons and drawing them closer to God as well. Now, the doctors of the church, I think is kind of interesting. For example, speaking of Aquinas, of course, he was named a doctor of the church long before his teacher was named a doctor of the church. They both are Saint, it's kind of neat, the universal doctor and expert doctor, St. Albert the Great. It was, a long time. I think, 1568 was when Aquinas was named doctor of the church, 1932 for his teacher, St. Albert the Great. But it's also interesting to me that it used to be like an all-boys club, right? But there are female doctors of the saint. When you think of St. Catherine of Siena, St. Therese of Lisieux, and St. Teresa of Avila, and so forth. So it really, these are very approachable people, despite their huge volume of knowledge.
Yeah, that's true, and it is worth pointing out that they're not made or declared doctors of the church in the same order that they lived, right? So in the podcast, we're going through them in the order in which they lived in history.
Oh, wonderful!
But I'm not really clear on any rhyme or reason how or why or when they get declared a doctor of the church, except that whatever Pope is the Holy Father at the time makes that determination. But you're right, there are 4 female doctors of the church. They are St. Hildegard of Bingen, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Teresa of Avila, and St. Therese of Lisieux.
And St. Hildegard is amazing. I dipped my toe in the water with her quite some time ago and was just blown away by the depth at which she wrote. And of course, she was into everything. And then the music that she composed, and according to I think her own writings, she was doing her best to replicate what she was hearing in prayer.
Yeah, right. Well, she is fascinating, and her music is a great entry point into her and her life.
Yeah,
absolutely. Speaking of music, I hear a little warning music there. That means we're going to take a break. We're going to pick it back up right after the break. Dr. Jim Papandrea is our guest here on Faith with Reasons. Thank you for joining us, and we will be right back.
You've heard that St. Paul Street Evangelization supports hundreds of teams of evangelists sharing the good news. But did you know that some of these teams are public prayer stations? Set up a sign on the sidewalk and offer prayer and encouragement to those you encounter. Everyone needs prayer. Try this new method of witnessing to Jesus. Contact St. Paul Street Evangelization to get started at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
My name's Father David Kidd, Director of Dawson Priestly Vocations for the Diocese of Toledo, and I'm here to pray with you today for vocations. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O God, who chose the apostles to make disciples of all nations, and who by baptism and confirmation have called us to build up your holy church, we implore you to choose among us, your children, many priests and religious who will serve you with their whole hearts and will gladly spend their lives making you known and loved by all. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Hello everyone, Bishop Daniel Thomas here, calling on you in my new role, not only as your bishop, but also as chairman of the USCCB Committee on Pro-Life Activities, calling on all the faithful throughout the Diocese of Toledo to stand up for life in this month of January, and of course all throughout the year, inviting you to join in praying for and witnessing to the protection, to the dignity and sanctity of all human life, and for an end to abortion.
Now, back to Faith with Reasons here on Annunciation Radio.
Hey, welcome back here. Shayne Stanfield with Ron Finn. And today we're blessed to have Dr. Jim Papandrea as professor of church history and historical theology at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. He's an award-winning author and professor of church history and historical theology, as well as the host of the Catholic Culture podcast, The Way of the Fathers. It's actually what we're discussing here today. He was baptized Catholic, confirmed Lutheran, and ordained Methodist. His study of the Church Fathers was the reason why he's back at the Catholic Church. And maybe if we have some time before the close of the program, you can remind us how that happened, since it's our discussion of topic today. You've written he's written more than 25 books that have been translated in multiple languages. Got a YouTube channel called The Original Church, of course there's a lot of information that can be found on his own website, www.jimpapandrea.com, and he's got an author Amazon page, drjimsbooks.com. So again, we were discussing the Catholic Culture production that you're hosting, that is the Way of the Fathers, and specifically the Doctors of the Church, which just began, I believe it was right at the first of the year, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We had our first introductory episode that aired on the first, and then we've had the two episodes of St. Bede the Venerable this month, and next month is St. Gregory of Narek.
So we concluded basically the first half hour of the program. Ron mentioned, it's typically an all-boys club, and yet we've got 4 of the 37 doctors of the church that have been named to date are women, and fascinating women, of course. And one thing that popped in my mind, Jim, that maybe we can discuss a little bit to the extent that about Teresa of Lisieux. And I've always understood that she had very little as far as writings were concerned, and yet we're discussing people that have that are teachers of the church. That's what doctors of the church are. They're essentially the church designate them as teachers. So how could somebody that has so little or so few writings be deemed a doctor? And maybe this would help folks understand. What is this element? Is it something that they're reflecting as far as their wisdom or their ability to write the wisdom that they have?
Yeah, that's a great point, because of all the doctors of the church, there is actually kind of a wide range of amount of literary product that they've left us, and so it isn't really necessarily that a doctor of the church has written a lot. It isn't really necessarily that a doctor of the church was officially a teacher during their life either, because to your point, St. Therese was not. What we have from her is her diary, basically. Yeah. And yet, every one of the doctors of the church, her included, have made a contribution that results in a significant influence on the church after their time. And so for Therese and for others who maybe haven't written a lot that we have or that we know of, what's evaluated in their writing is their ability to articulate the doctrines, the teachings of the faith correctly. So they have to be orthodox. They have to, in the sense of correct teaching, and in a way that is accessible to the general faithful. And so, although some of them are more accessible than others, like I was saying earlier, maybe Aquinas is one of those whose writings are not necessarily as accessible to the layperson, just in terms of being able to read them. Therese being on the other side of that, where her writing is very accessible. Anyone can read her diary, and anyone who reads it will be edified by it, and it will find that it improves their prayer life and their spiritual life in general. So The doctors are all different. They all have a different contribution, but they've all made a significant contribution.
So she's obviously writing about she's sharing her wisdom in a very simple way, I guess is another way that's coming to mind here. I mean, if you're looking at a single work, it's her diary. That's right. Yeah, so she's conveying a lot in very I guess very few words.
Well, it's true, and some doctors of the church write very sort of logically and as teachers, and you're reading their writings, and they sound like a professor, and
very heady. Yeah,
and they're saying, here's what I've figured out through philosophy and logic, and I've come to these conclusions, and the church says, yeah, that's great. With Therese, it's more like she just tells you what happens to her and what she does and how she responds and what she thinks, and it's just as wise as the ones that sound like professors. You get the sense she didn't even really realize just how wise she was. But even things as simple as the way she responds to people who annoy her, right? Mm-hmm. And you think, wow, if only I could emulate that kind of holiness, And yet she's just describing her day, but in doing so, she's teaching the reader really deep, significant stuff.
Yeah, a lot of deep theological lessons to be learned that you get the sense that maybe she didn't really learn those. She was kind of gifted with that knowledge, I guess, which I think is an inspiration to us because we can kind of operate in this little way too and emulate her. Now, these doctors of the church, they come from really various locations. They're all over the place. I know you mentioned previously St. Gregory of Narek, who was an Armenian monk and poet, and we will learn about him in this podcast series too, right?
Yes, that's right. In fact, I just recorded the first episode. Like I was saying earlier, every one of the doctors will have 2 episodes, and so I just recorded the first episode on St. Gregory, and I will get to the second one as well. And so the month of February is the month for his 2 episodes. And as it just so happens, his feast day is February 27th. And so that works out well.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you do it in 2-part because it gives us a chance to learn more about, do we learn about their personalities, their background, their history. We learn more about how their influence made them a doctor of the church, but do we learn some personal information about them too?
Some, and it's kind of like with anything else. Among the 37 doctors of the church, there are some that we know a lot about their life and their personality, and there are others we don't know as much. Gregory of Narek is one for whom we don't have a lot of information. I am, as much as I can when I do these episodes, I'm sorting through the scholarly work on them as well as the legendary material and trying to sort of manage that. But yeah, some of them we don't know as much, and others we know more. So it's a little bit different for each one.
So I've got a question. I'm sure there's going to be somebody in our audience that's wanting to ask. We've only got 37 that have been named doctors, 3 of them of women. Never heard of any of the apostles considered or called doctors. Why is that?
Right. I addressed that in my introductory episode to the series, and I really think that the reason is, and I've never seen an official reason stated, but I think the reason is that the apostles are in a category unto themselves, and they don't need to be declared doctors of the church by the church in order to be seen as trustworthy, especially the ones who wrote the New Testament.
Yeah.
They are the apostles, and so they are obviously trustworthy, and they're kind of in a category of their own. Mm-hmm. And so, as it turns out, the list of doctors of the church, it all begins after the time of the apostles.
I'm sorry if I missed this in the first half of the show. Did we discuss when this process of naming doctors began and why?
Oh, that's a great question, and I actually don't have at the top of my mind here when this began and who the first proclaimed doctor of the church is. That is a great question. I wish I had an answer for you, but I can't remember who that was.
I know
we'll save that for the next time you're on.
Yeah,
That's right.
I know we discussed it with the saints because you said we've got a formal process now that's been followed now for the last several hundred years, but the early church didn't necessarily do that, and I guess it came to mind. Did we discuss that with the doctors or the doctor, the doctor selection process?
Yeah, that's right. I would have to go back and look up which pope was the first one to declare someone a doctor of the church. Yeah, I don't have that at the top of my tongue.
Very good.
Well, you've been busy.
Yeah.
And of course, as we mentioned, Jim Papandrea is our guest today. And over 25 books, and most, a lot of them deal with this type of topic, the early church fathers and the doctors of the church, but also kind of a travelogue. I mean, you've kind of a pilgrim's guide to the eternal city, where you write about Rome. You've led pilgrimages, and you really kind of are kind of living the life that we would kind of vicariously like to live through you, because you've been to a lot of interesting places.
I haven't been everywhere. People think it's funny that I haven't been to the Holy Land because I just keep going back to Rome. So I did through my studies when I was doing my doctorate. I was able to study in Rome for a while, and so since then I've kind of become an expert on the city of Rome, and I have that book, The Pilgrim's Guide, which, by the way, is coming out this year in a revised version. So now that it's the Jubilee year for folks going to Rome this year, I'm hoping that will be out soon, the second edition of my Rome Pilgrim's Guide. But I just keep going back to Rome, and for the first time, I'm co-leading a pilgrimage somewhere else this year in December. Mike Aquilina and I are co-leading a pilgrimage to Sicily, and so looking forward to that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And of course, people traveling to Rome during this Jubilee year with Pilgrims of Hope can walk through the holy doors that are there. Even at the prison if you want to, right? But carry that guide with you. That'd be great. Now, as you talk about these doctors of the church, and I just want to remind people that you can check out the Way of the Fathers podcasts. They're available on Jim's YouTube channel, and of course, they're produced by CatholicCulture.org. So you can check those out from that website as well. And once you start following, you'll be prompted when a new episode comes out, right? So spend some time with it. And these are not, they're not 10 hours long, so they're very digestible, I would say.
Yeah. The series on the heresies that I did, those episodes are a bit longer. They're maybe a half hour to 40 minutes each, but we made the decision to split up the episodes on the doctors of the church into two for each, so that each episode could be a little bit shorter. So, we're trying to keep them, less than that to make them more accessible.
It appears to me what I've seen so far is it looks like you're trying to keep them right around the 20-minute mark.
That is the goal. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. These are very, very, very interesting. And you said your first series with Catholic Culture was the series on the heresies, correct? When Mike moved on.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
So, what was it? We did mention, and I guess I got a curiosity here with your return to the Catholic Church. What was it specifically with the church fathers? Not necessarily doctors at this point, and maybe it was, that interested you enough to start looking at the Catholic Church once again. I mean, you were ordained as Methodist, so you're
a deacon.
So you're practicing in the Methodist Church, and you got a curiosity with the fathers. What was it specifically, and did it involve the doctor of the church?
Well, what it was, in part at least, was that when I was coming up in the Protestant world and being confirmed and all this, we were taught in our catechism classes that the Protestant Reformation was this attempt to get back to original Christianity, that somehow there was this sort of pristine, pre-Catholic version of Christianity that the Catholics ruined by adding all their human traditions and superstitions. And now you know where this is going, because all of that is a myth. It's not true,
right, yeah,
right. But what I took away from that I've held on to my whole life is that it ought to be important to know what the original church was like. What was early Christianity like? That's important because it's closest in proximity to Jesus and the apostles. And so when it came time for me to do a PhD, I decided that I was going to study that original church. And lo and behold, come to find out, there is no such thing as pre-Catholic Christianity, right? To quote St. John Henry Newman, I hope I get it right, when it comes to the historical record, Christianity and Catholicism are synonyms, right? So in other words, the early church was the Catholic Church. And this is why my YouTube channel and some of the things I'm working on now are under the title of The Original Church, because I'm busting this myth of pre-Catholic Christianity. There's no such thing. The original church was the Catholic Church. And once I discovered that, and of course this was all happening at the same time that I got an opportunity to study in Rome, well, I knew by the time I finished my PhD, I knew that there was no way that I could not be in communion with the historic church. And so I knew I was coming back to Catholicism, and I did. So, that was 25 years ago, something like that now.
Amazing. Now, you were already ordained Methodist when you were in school, so you were getting your PhD for studies as a Methodist. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. Although one of the other things that was going on at this time, I had originally started the ordination process in the Methodist Church because I had gone to seminary, went to a Protestant seminary, and got a Master's of Divinity degree, which is, the degree you get if you're going into ministry, and didn't really know what else to do with it other than, continue on that path. I started on the path toward ordained ministry and kind of switched up and became a deacon. But in the end, I really discerned that, even apart from my discernment to come back to Catholicism, I also discerned that I am not called to ordained ministry. So for me, there was no question of, should I try to be a Catholic priest or even a Catholic deacon? I really discerned in my time in the Methodist Church that that's not my calling. I'm not called to liturgical leadership or pastoral care in any way, and I'm really called to the classroom to be a teacher. And so when I went back for the PhD, it was so that I could become a professor.
So was there a father, or was there a doctor whose writings that you that was the light bulb moment for you, or was it just generally the concept that the early church had to be Catholic? Because I'm not sure if there's any. You almost have to be reading the fathers of the church and their works, and knowing that they were Catholic to come to that conclusion. Am I right?
That's right. It was for the most part the reading widely in the early church fathers, getting a sense of the general consensus of their thought. I mean, if there was a light bulb, let's say doctrine for me, it was the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I mean, it was let's say virtually universal in the early church, which is funny because the early Christians argued over even the doctrine of the Trinity. The one thing the early Christians didn't argue over was the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And when I saw that all of the early church fathers believed this, that was certainly a light bulb moment for me.
Yeah, and I've heard similar explanations from many people that have gone to the Catholic Church based on what they found in these writings. Is there one that you can? We're talking very, very, very early church fathers that blatantly discusses this. And I guess this would be a two-part question. Then the second one was somebody with your background, your knowledge, you studied as a Protestant. How do others that have gone through such studies as Protestants? Surely they must be exposed to these writings, and how do they just kind of push that under the rug?
Yeah, well, first of all, when I studied it, to answer the first part of the question,
Mm-hmm.
Saint Irenaeus of Lyon actually is one of the early ones where, when you let's say you're reading the Fathers of the Church series or something, and you're reading this in an English translation that's maybe 100 years old and translated by Protestants, and you see, you read Irenaeus and it says something, and then you see a footnote, and the footnote tells you, well, in the Greek, it actually says the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. And so it's clear that not only does Irenaeus believe this, but the Protestant translator has tried to obscure it. And
by putting that as a footnote, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's that. But then, I do have a lot of colleagues in the Guild who have studied all the same documents I have, and they're still Protestant. Now, to be fair, I also have a significant number of colleagues who, like me, have come over to the Catholic Church because they are experts in the early church. And so that happens a lot. But for those who remain Protestant, they have their own reasons. A lot of it has to do with the investment that they already have or the life that they already have in their particular Protestant denomination. And for others, it especially let's say those in the more progressive or mainline denominations of Protestantism, there's a kind of thank God we know better now attitude, like that somehow we're smarter than the Christians of the early church just because we live later in time. And so I think that's a real thing that has to be overcome.
Yeah.
That is sort of a product of our post-Enlightenment world, that is, this assumption that we're just automatically smarter because we live now as opposed to then. So that gets in the way as well.
Right, so it's like head knowledge versus heart knowledge.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, when you think about these doctors of the church, going back to, the 200s, they're still relevant today in many cases. Many of them are. I mean, some of them I think we'd find relate more to a past time, but so many of them really speak to us in the here and the now today, and are bringing people closer to Christ, maybe back into the church, and still teaching us, long beyond their passing.
Yeah, that's really true. And part of the reason for that is because they understood the priority of, let's say, personal holiness and sanctification, as opposed to what a lot of people now present as Christianity, which is some form of social gospel or social transformation, right? So the early Christians were not as, let's say, focused on current events, and so that means that their writings are more timeless.
So, just a point of clarification. You said that you had read Irenaeus. What are we talking about? 2nd century?
Yeah, he's actually writing towards the end of the 2nd century. So, like in the 180s, 190s. So 100 years after the later documents of the New Testament. Yeah,
which is amazing, because you're picking up something that's that old, and it's irrefutable about what's being said.
Well, that's right, and we could even go earlier than that. We can go to Saint Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the early 2nd century, like in the first decade of the 2nd century. He was probably a student of St. John the Apostle, at least indirectly, and we can see the same kind of stuff there already. Not just the church's Eucharistic theology, but also the church's understanding of itself, of the church, of the hierarchy, and of tradition, and all the things that we would still believe.
So if there's one doctor of the 37 that you would recommend for somebody to begin, reading, would you suggest Saint Therese of Lisieux, just to start off simple, or would you recommend going with someone else?
Well, that's not a bad choice because, again, one can read her diary, and it's very accessible, very easy to get into, and easy to read. If someone wanted something a little bit more theological, one of my favorites is St. Ambrose.
Oh, yeah.
Because Ambrose did a great job of sort of synthesizing Eastern and Western thought on things like the sacraments and presenting them in a way that I think anyone can read. So I'm also a big fan of St. Ambrose. But I don't know, you almost can't go wrong if you, no matter where you start in the doctors, I would just say look for shorter documents that you can digest as opposed to, jumping into the Summa or something.
Oh, yeah. If anybody doesn't know what we're talking about, just picking up the Summa is an accomplishment in itself. It's rather thick.
Yes.
But once you open it and start reading, you're quickly tempted to put it back down.
Yeah. Yeah, well, imagine how big it would be if you'd finished it. Check out the podcast. That would be a wonderful opportunity to really dig into this a little bit and have Jim kind of guide you through that particular doctor of the church. And, of course, that's available at catholicculture.org. And I'll tell you what, I got to send people to your website, too, jimpapandrea.com, because people can access not only, your YouTube channel, but also your books and your music as well. And I know we talked about that last time you were on the show. But you're a multi-talented man, and people should kind of explore it and become part of the family, so to speak, by joining the original church community. Always a pleasure and always enlightening when we have you on. Dr. James L. Papandrea, our guest today. It's been a quick hour, so we appreciate you coming on. And thank you so much for this gift of your knowledge that you're spreading with us. In fact, your knowledge is so vast, you might become a doctor of the church one of these days.
Well, I don't know about that, but it's been a blessing to be on the show, so thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we appreciate that. Again, check out the website, jimpapandrea.com, and, of course, the Amazon author page, drjimsbooks.com. And we thank you for listening, for joining us on today's edition of Faith with Reasons. Hopefully you'll join us next week.